Hi there, this is Carl Irwin, and this is going to be an overview, an ongoing look at Musescore 4, which came out about just last month, and I've been using it a lot more in writing music in it rather than just importing old scores. I worked on a project here just over a couple days in some free time, and I wrote a piece, and we're going to take a look at it. I'm going to play it back, and then we're going to kind of... I know you can't see very well what's going on here. I want you to see the full score as it plays through, and then I'll zoom in, and we'll take a look at some attributes here. Just know that I'm fully well aware that what you see on here isn't typically how you would write music, but what we're looking at here with Musescore 4 is not the engraving side of it, but actually the thing that's caused more waves, no pun intended, is the engine, the sound reproduction engine. So the sampled sound, a Muse Sounds engine, and those sounds that are in there. And I want to address some statements that I've heard about the program and justify some of them and try to combat some of them as well. But first, let's listen to the piece. Now, I'm going to hit play and let this run through, but for the purpose of what we're going to be talking about, what you're actually going to hear is a fully rendered rendition of it. No hiccups, no clicks, nothing like that. And it has been mastered. So it's already gone through a mastering process to be finalized. But it is the output from this engine as you would hear it here. And the reason for doing that we'll get to in a moment when we get to the end of it. So it'll play along here, but you're going to hear a fully mastered rendition of this. So this is Timepiece. It's for a chamber orchestra, kind of a larger chamber orchestra string section. The way I have it scored here is I have solo quartet strings, 2 violins, viola, and then cello, and then I've got the string section down here. Because of what I'm doing, there's actually a sub-bass synthesizer here to support the low end, something we do in recording, just kind of demonstrating that capability directly from the export. There's a piano, harpsichord, a couple of mallet instruments, a Glock, vibraphone, marimba, and then single wind parts. So a single flute, single oboe, single clarinet, single bass clarinet, single bassoon, single horn, single trumpet, single trombone, and that's the wind complement. So a very small chamber kind of orchestra, symphony orchestra kind of scoring, but a chamber sort of setting. So, all right, let's listen to Timepiece. Okay, so a fun little, I don't know, little test of the capability here. Pretty simple kind of writing going on. It doesn't have a very solid tonal center. I guess you would call this A minor, but it's got somewhat of a pantonality to it where it wanders around. There's not a lot of functional harmony apart from the cadence points in the phrases. Strong 5-1 in there just to give you grounding, but it wanders fairly freely into other tonalities. A lot of mediant modulating chords in there. A little filmic, I guess. What kind of writing today isn't? I don't know. But anyway, that's the piece in general. Let's take a look at what's going on here and why, and what some of the nagging things that have been on my mind since putting Musescore 4 to the test. So, first of all, I'm going to weigh in on this again. I've done a couple videos already looking at the very first look at Musescore 4, but after having written some music in it here, this and a couple of other professional projects, things that I'm doing for real work, not just kind of on the side, I find that Musescore 4 suffers more crashes than a county fair demolition derby in the state of Kentucky. It crashes an awful lot, and this is a pretty strong system. This is Linux Ubuntu Studio. This is the current long-term service distribution for Ubuntu Studio, Ubuntu variant, Kubuntu, KDE, real-time kernel. I'm running Pipewire on this, and I've heard some people have had issues. I actually have another system running the exact same operating system with slightly better specs, although an older processor, older sound card or older processor, but a bigger one. And Musescore won't even play. You can't even get sound out of it. Won't play back. The playhead won't move. You can't enter notes and get sound. It's completely unusable, in spite of the fact that it's the exact same operating system and setup and same software kind of environment. I have another machine that's almost identical to this one, almost exactly the same specs, same brand machine. It's just a year earlier model. And on that one, everything works okay. The Muse Hub works perfectly fine, opens up fine. But on this machine, the Muse Hub won't work without some kind of administrator permission, which is really bizarre. Then I have some other machines, a couple of really old, just dual core, or I guess, yeah, I think they're dual core machines. No, they're i5s. No, they're quad core, but they're older processors. Lower RAM, much lower RAM at my work that run everything fine. They get sound. I haven't written any music on it. I would assume that it would probably have the same crashing issues. But the Muse Hub works fine there, and it runs fine. And then one other very modern machine with a pretty high processing power. Similar kind of story. Things seem to work okay. I have found some crashing going on, but I haven't written a lot of music on that machine. So, and the reasons why things crash, they're no good reasons, right? It'll just do it. Sometimes it'll crash on playback, which probably shouldn't be surprising given the play engine. Sometimes it'll crash just because you changed a note in a measure, and then when you come back to it, every time you click on that note in that measure, it crashes. It's like it creates a corruption. It might play through the note. You might be able to select the measure before that measure and the measure after, but you can't select that measure and you can't change that note and you can't edit it permanently. It's just permanently ruined. I'll talk about workarounds for some of this. But anyway, dealing with Musescore 4 right now requires you to be a very hacky individual. You're going to have to find hacks to get it to work for you. This is frankly not production ready. It just isn't production ready. Do not use this for your production material. I highly recommend, if you only use Musescore, particularly if you're a Linux person, then you only use Musescore. You don't use anything else. But if you're on Linux, or even if you're on one of the other operating systems and you're using Musescore, you really need to hang on to your 3.6 version and keep doing your work in that. And then I recommend maybe exporting work that you've done into Musescore 4 and tinkering around a little bit with the engraving. If you want to get the benefits of the engraving, I recommend you import projects that have already been scored elsewhere. Otherwise, you're just going to be banging your head on the keyboard dealing with this program, trying to write complex music. Simple music, probably not too much of a problem, but I found that as you get complex rhythms, complex articulation, more instrumentation, just really weird things happen, and they happen often. Just very strange things. And there's so many crashing moments that you can't catalog it. I mean, you talk to the developers at Musescore and they say, well, make sure you file a bug report. If I filed a bug report for everything I've run into, it would be the only thing I'd be doing, is sitting at the computer filing bug reports and then trying to run diagnostics, which quite frankly I'm not suited to do, is to run a bunch of Linux commands to get bug documentation to share. This just wasn't ready. It wasn't ready. They should have released this, in my opinion. They should have released the program as a beta release, keeping the excuse me, bit of a cough I'm getting over here, keeping the 3.6 series more prevalent on the main page. And they should have they should have done a softer release on this, because I think people are going to get highly frustrated going to Musescore, downloading this as kind of the only option on the page. I know it says, older versions, but they're going to go for this because it's the thing that they're advocating, and finding that it just is difficult to deal with. And most people not being very hacky with their software, they won't know what to do. They won't know where to go. They won't really know how to deal with it. Now, let's look at the piece here and talk about what's going on. I'm going to zoom in a lot so you can see what's happening. So you'll notice right away that there's a lot of articulations, an enormous amount of articulations. You'll see weird things like tremolo showing up in weird places on these string parts. So let me give you some philosophy here. This is, if you hung in there with me, I give long talks and tutorials, but it's worth it. I'm a school teacher. I get into the detail. Hopefully you've hung in there long enough. But here's the thing. I've heard some complaints. This is the good side to Musescore 4 and the development that's been going on. I've heard some complaints saying that, well, the sounds they're not there yet. People noticing that there's big jumps and it's just not real. It's not perfectly real. It's a lot closer, but it's not real. It's got a long way to go to get real. So here's the thing. It has always been that if you wanted real, you had to take your music into a MIDI sequencer. You'd have to go to a digital audio workstation environment where you have control over all of the MIDI data. You can apply the instruments of your choosing and mix and match and use whatever budget level you're at. But even back in the 90s, when people were just getting into MIDI sequencing, they were using some pretty low-grade samples and still managing to get extremely realistic renditions. And the reason why they were able to do that is because they were managing the MIDI data at a very high detail. When you do that, you begin to incorporate what I call the relativity of music performance. So in music performance, there's a great amount of relativity with dynamics, with rhythm, with dynamic changes, certainly with expression. All the things are relative. If you just take dynamics, for example, forte is not a number on a volume knob. It just isn't. It's not like forte out of a 1 through 10. Forte is not an 8. That's not how it works. It's relative to the piece, to the context, to the instrumentation. As a trumpet player, if I'm playing in an ensemble, if I'm playing in a brass quintet, forte on one piece in that group is something entirely different than forte on another piece in a symphony orchestra. for me. It's different. It's not exactly the same volume. It's not the same texture. It's not the same quality. There is a relativity to notation and to music performance. Because of that, they'll never really be able to make an engine that just plays scores engraved as they are to be read and makes them absolutely realistic. This ain't going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's never been that way. And of all of the notation-based playback engines out there, they all suffer that same problem. Now, will it give you a very good concept of what it is you're writing? Yes, that's the goal. That's the point. This is a notation program. It's not really a mock-up program. Mock-up programs are digital audio workstations, MIDI data, MIDI entry, sample sound sets, sampled instruments. It's a combination of a bunch of peripheral pieces of software that go together and libraries to make things exactly, precisely, to every detail the way you want it to be. Now, can you make Musescore 4 sound quite real? Well, I would think that from listening to that, the answer is yes. Yes, you can make it. I really think they just absolutely knocked this play engine and the sampled set out of the park. Now, people are going to make some gripes about how certain dynamics jumping, maybe the brass dynamics jumping from mezzo forte to forte seems too wide. But there's ways to deal with that, right? There's ways to deal with that because you have some other sample options. You also have the mixing capability. You have the option to make multiple tracks for one instrument. I could do 2 trumpet tracks, one that deals with the forte stuff, but it's actually a mezzo forte with accents on it. See, you can mix and match all of these articulations to give it humanity, to make it human. If I want a double stop sound and I want it to sound real, I want it to sound like people played it, I'm going to use the upward, this upward roll figure. See how I've applied that every time I need a double stop. So there's an upward roll, which is going to give me the sound of the human double stop. You got to use things like that. If I want articulations to sound uniquely different, I probably wouldn't put all these articulations on here. I'd probably just put staccato on everything. But you'll notice I have a mix of accent, staccato, marcato, and I have all of these changes on here to give the humanity to the performance, to sound like a person's playing it. Notice there's some tremolo hashes on here in a couple places. I don't have these tremolo hashes. Let me zoom in more. You really see it. I don't have these on here because I want the player to play that. I have these on here in kind of conspicuous locations just every now and then to give that sort of bouncing grit that you would get from a real player playing aggressively bowing into that long note and getting kind of that gritty, scratchy bounce on it. You can achieve that just sneaking in some tremolo every now and then because there's a sample for that in the Muse Sounds. Notice over here how offset all these dynamics are. This is not how I would engrave this. I would have a dynamic that would arrive here and then it would decay, right? So it would arrive probably midway through the second measure in 5/4 here, and then it would decay. Then it would graduate back out again to the 3/4. But I have them all offset because this is how people would do it. This person would arrive there a little earlier than this person, and this person would be 1 beat later than that person. This person would be very early on this note. And then they would decay, and they would not arrive at exactly the same spot, even though the notation indicates that. To get realism, you have to make variants, and you have to do it with the notation, because that's how this play engine works. Musescore 4's play engine does not work off of MIDI. It works off of notation. So in order to get the variance that you would need as you would in a digital audio workstation using MIDI data, you have to use the notation symbols in order to give you that variance, right? Articulations, dynamics. There's also some things that Musescore makes errors on. Let's come out here real quick. Also, I mean, I have harpsichord playing here. One thing you ought to know about harpsichord, it's always in the same dynamic level. There's no accents. There's no articulation for harpsichord. You got to kind of know these things about instruments. I have this at a mezzo forte beginning to end. It never changes because that's realistic. I shouldn't have accents. Now I have a piano in here, and that has dynamic changes in articulation and whatnot. Find a spot. So up here, I have a piano, and then I have another piano on the flute part. Because I was finding in the playback, it never really caught this piano on note 1. It will always accentuate that note. I also found that I really want this at mezzo piano. I really want all of it at mezzo forte. But I found that the initial iterations on some of these instruments were a little too harsh, given the articulations I wanted to use, these marcato articulations. So what I did is I graduated the dynamics. I started with piano. I placed one piano on the rest ahead so that the play engine would know, yes, this is piano, and it wouldn't make a hiccup on that note. You have to work with the hacky kind of nature of this release, right? It's not going to get every note exactly right. You hear some of that in some of the playbacks you're hearing online right now, just letting it play. Now, I can sit there and say, well, yeah, it's not really ready for prime time. Or I can say, you know what, this is good enough if I know what to do to make it perfect. Musescore 4 is good enough that if you know what to do to make it perfect, you can get some pretty compelling mock-ups. But you're going to have to make these playback files with a lot of variance in articulation and dynamics, and rhythmic variance as well, which I didn't do too much on this one. I have in some other mock-ups I've done. So let's listen to a little bit of this. Notice too, I've got this tremolo figure going on. Again, I don't want the player to play tremolo. I have the tremolo on these solo instruments because I want the grit, right? I want the grit to stand out. So let's listen to a part here. Hopefully we don't get a crash-orama. Okay, I'll start at this spot here. So there's another thing. So right there, that's bizarre. If you select a note in Musescore and then hit play, it ought to start at that note. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it does not. So, yeah, weird kinds of things that shouldn't be. And the desire, I understand the desire of the developers to have all these bug reports, but, I can't put a lot of time into that. They need to test their stuff better on multiple systems. I mean, they just need to have their people composing on a variety of systems and hardware so that they can see for themselves. All right, here we go. Offset dynamics. Very convincing, when you do these tricks. So that's not how it would be scored. It would be scored with unified dynamic change. So I had these little tremolo figures in there, and you didn't notice them, but if I didn't have it, you would miss it, right? Putting it in there gives that, because these parts are doubled too, it gives that sort of quality. It looks like I got a note here out of whack. That shouldn't be down there. There's some trouble too with Musescore, what is that, Violin 1? Oh yeah, it should be way up. Whoops. There's some trouble with the grabbing feature. It's just so easy to accidentally grab things and move them around. I've found, which I didn't seem to experience much with Musescore 3.6. You only have to be in close proximity to things. It just grabs onto stuff and then it moves it around rather than moving. Like if I'm on white space it shouldn't think that I'm grabbing a note. But I found that it does do that a lot. Yeah, variants, playback files. This is how you get realism. If you're interested in Musescore 4 for the ability that it has to make things sound more real or to do mock-ups without using a digital audio workstation, kind of cutting the time fractionally down because the Play engine is intuitive, or it has good, it's not really intuitive, it has good programming, then you should know about the concept of making playback files. Make a playback file. I keep harping on this, but some of you out there need to hear it. Make a file that is not for engraving. Make your engraved version, write your music, then copy that, make a copy of that, and then on the copy, make variants. Move things around, change articulations, shift around dynamic changes, give it human variants. Deal with hiccups that happen in the score. If things pop out when they shouldn't, go in there and add a dynamic level or add an articulation or take something away to make it more realistic. That's really how you get realism in this engine. One of the comments that was made specifically was, well, with a proper VST, well, that's, Musescore 4, Muse Sounds is a proper VST. The problem is that the environment is not what we're used to. We're not used to sequencing mock-ups by notation. Most people aren't. I'm used to doing it because 20-some years ago, we used to do that with Finale and Sibelius. We would mock up playback files so that we could get a more realistic rendition of what it is that we wrote. We'd had to make a playback file that had variants in it that would give us the retardandos and using tempo changes and whatnot, because those capabilities weren't created yet. We used to multi-track render out in kind of the old standard software packages, Finale and Sibelius, mixing and matching sound samples that were available within the program, and then in an audio editor remixing so that we'd get something close. We played these tricks all the time. So you just have to take that skill set and bring it into this, okay? Out of the digital audio workstation and onto the notation page, using the articulations and these samples that are available to us. There's quite a few layers of samples per instrument in this engine that they've made and in this library. You just have to use the tools that are available to make it work. And you can. I have noticed, I'm not sure that Fortissimo and 3F's Fortissimo, that they're really different. They seem to cap at forte, the sampled sets. I don't know that they really get louder. I did notice that after I kind of mocked all of this up. I found that was one kind of unusual difference. That maybe they'll expand that out and give you some more samples later on. But yeah, whatever it is you're dealing with, experiment with articulations. Let's say your mezzo forte, you want a forte, but you don't want to get the samples of the forte that they're using. They're a little too cuivre. They're a little too brassy, right? Well, what you can do is just throw some accents on your mezzo forte notes. And now you've got the in-between. Just accent everything. Put accents on all of it, right? Accents even with a slur, legato phrasing. Whatever. Mix and match and see what you get. Try things like that. Or create a different channel that has a different instance of that instrument where that part can jump to, and in the mixer you can turn it up a little bit, or you can put the forte on it and turn it down a little bit, right? Play around with panning. Make sure you're panning these instruments in space. So one pan trick I used here is that I have my quartet panned slightly opposite of the section strings. Now, it wouldn't really be like that in real life, but what it does is it suddenly gives me a pretty solid stereoscopy when all of them are playing. So it still sounds like my violin 1 is way off to the left, but because violin 1 is slightly to the right, when it plays with violin 1 in the section violin 1s, now it sounds like a group that's in space off to the left, but I hear that one lone sound that's more central and to the right. Right? It doesn't stand out. It improves the believability of it all. You got to play around with these settings, with these things, at least the ones that are available. In Linux right now, on the mixer, there's not a lot available. We can't do any effects. We don't have the capability to add any effects right now in Linux. But we do have pan and we do have faders. We have at least that. So, and we have sounds. We have the option to change sounds. So, another thing, a trick I used to use on even in a MIDI sequencer is to get a really kind of shimmery sound. I would use tremolo samples very low, pull the faders way down, but double tremolo over top of regular section strings. Right? And now it starts to add that grit that pops out every now and then, because it's actually a tremolo sample that's in the background. You do a tremolo sample that's really low, you do regular section strings, and then you put a soloist and pan the soloist way out somewhere. And then all of a sudden, in the MIDI sequencer, in the digital audio workstation, you have a really realistic kind of sound using just, very ho-hum vanilla samples. Right? You improve it. Now imagine, what does that look like inside of Musescore? Well, what that is you create 3 tracks of the same instrument and you do the same thing. You just apply the same thing, use the fader, use the pan, and then you get realism. Use articulations, change the dynamic, from the engraved version to give some variance. You just got to, use all these articulations that are available to you. Anyway, so I just wanted to touch on that. So Musescore 4 is beta music. This is beta software. This is not ready for production. It's just, look, I got to prove it to you. I'll end with this just so you can enjoy at Musescore's expense. On this happened. I had a situation where I changed a note. And suddenly this measure is corrupted. This one right here. This one right here. If I click on this measure, select it, particularly on beat 1, it crashes the program. I mean, what in the world? It just crashes, always, on this one. It plays fine through that. I can select this section. Oh, there it goes. Right? So how, let me get rid of my OSB. How do you deal with that, right? What do you do when you have that kind of issue? How do you edit when you can't select the note anymore? Right? I mean, this is really important. What do you do? Well, the hacky answer to that is you select the measure before the corruption. You go through the corrupted area. So here's the problem area. I don't want it to crash again. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to select over here. Let's say I need to edit a note that's here. And if I click on that note to edit it, to move it, to change it, anything, add an articulation, whatever, it'll crash the program. What I need to do is select over here on a measure that's clean, select through the measure, copy the whole area, Control-C, paste this into an empty spot, edit it, copy that, bring it back and paste it. I did this probably, I don't know, over 30, 40 times just writing this piece in different areas because this kind of stuff happened. That's the only way I could write the piece. It's the only way I could sequence this together was by doing this hacky kind of stuff just to get the play engine, right? So my recommendation is write your music in a lower version for now, 3.6, the last version that works best for you, and then take your engraved version, make a playback file in 3.6, import your just kind of knowing what you'll deal with. Import the playback file into Musescore 4 and then tweak it a little bit. That's what you should do. So, yeah, that's my recommendation for this. If you really want to use it now for production stuff, it's got to be kind of a last step in the chain after you've done most of the work somewhere else. I think that's really the way to go. So that's it. That's what I've got to share with you. I don't think there's anything else I left out. I'm impressed. I am. Don't get me wrong. I'm impressed with the work they've done It just isn't really. It's not really. They shouldn't have released it the way they did. I don't think they should have put it out as a soft beta release on the main page with 3.6 still highlighted as the release. I think that would have been smarter. But whatever, hopefully the other thing too is I'm a little concerned, I've mentioned this before, about their priorities. I've explained that we've lost the ability to sync with video because now they don't use a jack back end or MIDI timecode output. I also noticed that the VST and effects capability on Linux is not the highest category of priority. It's the second to high. It's a penultimate level. That's scary. That's scary, people. That ought to be high because they need to be working to make their cross-platform release universally cross-platform. But I think they're favoring Windows because more people are running the software on Windows. That's, I believe that. I haven't seen anything that indicates otherwise to me. And I am afraid I don't think these releases are going to come out all that often. I think it's going to be a while. I hope I'm wrong. I hope they prove me wrong. But I think it's going to be a long while before we see improvements on the 4 series. It's going to be a while before we see 4.1. I think it's going to be a while. And when we finally do, I think it's going to be underwhelming. I think there's not going to be a lot of great improvement. I think there's still going to be a lot of crashing going on. I think they have so much to deal with the crashing problem. I mean, I can't even export audio on this thing without it crashing. I did find when you export audio, here's a quick tip for this. So I did talk about copying and pasting sections, right? And in a second area and then bringing it into this, wherever you have it and pasting it back in. That's one way to get around that. When you export, the one possibility, I did find that I could export at 32,000 hertz. But 441 and 48, no go. 48 was a little better. It got a little further. 441 was a non-starter. It just crashed immediately. So I have to use the much lower sample rate. And this is not a big deal. I mean, honestly, MP3 sits around this level. Audio CD sits around here, and this is overkill. So it's not a big deal, but it is. You have to resort to a lot of hacky stuff to make this work. On another project, I found that changing a rhythm on a timpani part made it's like the Y2K scenario, right? The concern at Y2K, if you remember that far back, or if you're old enough to know about that. They were afraid whenever the millennium changed from the 1900s to the 2000s because there was a series of zeros, and what a series of zeros would do to the coding on computer systems. They had all these preparations and plans for just a total, software meltdown in various systems, which never happened. But it's like changing something in a measure. Just Y2K's the thing. It permanently alters it in such a way that it's corrupt. The file still opens, it still plays, you can still work around with it, but man, don't touch that note. Don't touch that measure. Permanent. You can't do anything about it. You could delete the measure and then replace the measure. I found you could do that. Also, some instruments, like I said, timpani. I had one where a corrupt part was corrupt. I found that by changing the timpani sound to the sound font, the MS Basic sound, then it would work. I didn't really want that sound, but I had to do that, and that's what I ended up having to do for the project. So, anyway, a lot of things going on there. So this is a discussion on realism. How do you make it more real? You've got to tweak around with the articulations, the dynamics, make more layers, treat the notation environment like the sequencer environment. If you do that, you can make, frankly, absolutely real renders on this engine really quickly. And I'm impressed by that. So I wanted to share that with you. Anyway, good luck with that. Happy mixing.